Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I want to just briefly introduce the other two SIG officers who are here. We have our Vice Chair, Ali Miano, and our Secretary, Joseph Perotti Brown. And you know, we really encourage you to make sure that you're keeping up on our SIG community page. We've been working on setting up some coffee chats and some online coffee chats that we thought might be kind of fun for the SIG. And we also have an upcoming webinar again towards the end of May with Terry Osborne. That date has not been finalized yet, but please do keep an eye on that. We also have access to past webinars that you can find in the community page. So please make sure that you are checking there and connecting with all of us. But for now, I would love to introduce Krishauna Hines-Gaither. I've known her for a number of years now and admire the work that she does. And she's just a wonderful person, wonderful presenter. And I'm very pleased that she agreed to join us today and share her expertise. And so I will turn it over to Krishauna. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Cassie. So I just want to acknowledge that I know that this is a very different time that we're living through right now, and all trying to figure out how to manage, how to navigate it. So I just want to kind of send good thoughts, good spirits your way as we're trying to navigate these difficult times. My name is Krishauna Hines-Gaither, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I taught Spanish for 17 years. I still do adjunct work, but I have immigrated to administration now. And so I am now the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Guilford College. And I also direct their Intercultural Engagement Center as well. Some people call it Multicultural Center or other titles of that sort. I've been at Guilford College for 3 years. And I'm delighted to be here. I have a lot of friends within the social justice SIG, so it's great to be here today. All right, we have about an hour, so we will jump right in. Okay, so I wanted to start out with this slide. I met Cassie and many of the folks in this picture many years ago, many years ago, before we had children, before we were partnered with our spouses. And so it's just so nice to still be engaged in such a robust community. And I met all of these folks through ACTFL and through the SIG work, through the German SIG, the African American SIG. This one didn't exist at that time. But I want to say that at the time when I met Cassie, over 10 years ago, well, gosh, probably about 15 years ago, actually. At the time when I met Cassie, I think I can speak for us and say we didn't have a lot of answers to a lot of the questions that people are asking now, which is why all of us ended up doing our master's thesis and our dissertations on topics that revolve around social justice. Because at that time, a decade and a half ago, a lot of the answers that we are engaging with now, having difficult dialogues, engaging students of color, et cetera, we didn't have a lot of those answers. And so we were just people who had a lot of passion and were working, trying to find a lot of the information that, that we're sharing with you now. So it's a real honor to still be engaged with this work and with this SIG in particular. I'm so glad that it started. Years ago, when Cassie Glenn, that is, finished her dissertation, she gave a presentation at ACTFL, and she said she was researching why there weren't as many African American students engaged in language programs, and particularly for her, that would be the German program. And she, at ACTFL, gave a presentation that really stuck out to me, and it said, through her narratives and her interviews that she collected, that African American students wanted the content in their language classes to be engaging, to be accessible, and they wanted to feel connected. I added relevant to it just over the years of doing my own study, but I think all of that still matters. And so when engaging these difficult dialogues, I think we have to keep these 4 tenets very close to us. I want to just bring out my friend Tamara Hughes Akimbo, who is a Spanish teacher in the in North Carolina. And I gave a presentation at her school. I published this. It was so impactful to me that I published it in the ACTFL Language Educator over a decade ago now, but it still guides why I do what I do. And so I went to her class, gave a presentation on Afro-Latinx communities. The language has evolved over time. And at the end of the presentation, I asked the students if they have any questions. And this is what was stated. And so at the end of the presentation, I asked, are there any questions or comments? After a slight delay and some prompting, a brave white male student responded. And he said, I feel like I've been learning the same history for years. Social studies is one of my least favorite subjects. If I could learn stuff like what you're teaching, I would love social studies. His comments were the foundation for the dialogue that followed. Next, a student from El Salvador responded, living in the United States, I do not know very much history about my country, but through your presentation, I learned a lot. I wish that I could learn more about my culture in school. Finally, an African-American student responded, although I have friends who are white and who are Hispanic, we know very little about each other's culture and history. This really shows why we need our classrooms to be engaging, accessible, connected, and relevant. And so I think from these students, they really speak to the need to go deeper than just what our curriculum may say. We may have to deviate from that somewhat to be on the crust of engaging in social justice dialogues, because students are telling us they want to know more. So I ask you kind of an introspective question, what's your why? Why are you doing what you do? That's a question that I would say that we all need to have an answer for. For me, it's exactly what's on the screen. I'm listening to the voices of students, and they guide what I do and guide my practice. But I think it's a question that we all have to have before us. Why is it important to even engage in the types of conversations related to social justice and identity? And so I want to just kind of frame this in the 5 levels of oppression and making sure that we keep those before us, because they'll come up a bit during the presentation. But when we speak about oppression, we're talking about so many different levels, the personal level, the interpersonal, institutional, cultural, and the systemic. And so a lot of times our students don't know that they're conflating a lot of these different systems, and they need us to help them to kind of unpack those. And so when they say things like, for example, this school, this school is this or this school is that, what are they really talking about? Are they talking about that on an institutional level? Is it a really rules and practices and procedures? Is it a cultural level? Is it subgroup level? Is it on a personal level, their own ideas and beliefs, etc.? And so that can also help us to know how to address situations when we understand what system is in operation. And oftentimes it's an intersection of many different systems at play. So the history of your institution, it does matter. Oftentimes when students are disgruntled, very passionate, upset about a certain topic, it may have very little to do with your individual classroom or perhaps even with you as an instructor, and it may be the culture of the institution that is perpetuating different levels of marginalization. And so we have to look at our systems that are in operation in our institutions. And this quote says, the first step is for educators to consider the historical context and mission of the institution, because this examination will offer greater insights about systems and the institutional structures. And so what about your institution? Where I teach at Guilford College, it's a 4-year college, small liberal arts college, Quaker school. These are the demographics of the institution. And so it's a predominantly white institution, about 55% white, about 45% students of color. I always say we always need to break up that 45%. That is not a monolith, but those are all individualized groups. But nevertheless, it is a predominantly white institution. For where I am in North Carolina, these numbers are actually quite good, comparatively speaking. If we compare them to aspirant institutions, these diverse numbers for where we live are pretty favorable numbers. However, this is our staff demographic. So I'm going to go back to the students and then staff. These are non-teaching staff. So these are folks who work at the college, but they are non-teaching. You see that pie, that peach-colored pie, that slice gets larger and larger. And then with our faculty, even larger. And so our faculty is about 80% white. There's no way that you can have a population that's almost half students of color, but you have a faculty, our teaching staff, that is almost 80% white, and there not be a need to engage in difficult dialogues. In my office, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I have students all the time who file in about this disconnect that happens across differences, and also intergroup within groups as well, and also faculty and staff who come to our office about these disconnects that happen. So I'm really excited that you all are asking the questions today. What are some tools that we can use to engage? So one of the questions that I have in the poll is, what language levels are represented here?
So we'll just give everyone 30-ish, 40 seconds to vote. And it is multiple choice, so you can select multiple ones. Can you see that, Krishauna?
Let's
the results.
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Yes, I sure can. Okay. So 5%, this is so neat. Okay. 5% elementary, 18% middle school, 62% high school, 5% community college, and 23% undergraduate or graduate. Okay. So the majority of us are coming from secondary institutions. Great. All right. I hope there's something for everyone as we move forward. Okay. Thank you for participating. And so I'm going to frame difficult dialogues in the context of the 4 stages of intergroup dialogue. Intergroup dialogue is a little bit different than just kind of classroom dialogue as we may be thinking of it, but I think it's still extremely relevant to our discussion today. And so this information is taken from the National Institute for Intergroup Dialogue, which is at University of Michigan. We had just the pleasure of going to their institute from Guilford College, and then we learned so much that we ended up inviting them to come to our college to do a follow-up 2-day training with us. And so they have these 4 stages of engaging in dialogue, which I just think are tried and true, and they have a lot of research to back them. In your free time, please look at the National Intergroup Dialogue Institute on their website. They have more information than you would probably have time to go through, but it's such great resources and very empirically based. And so they say if you want to engage in difficult dialogues, the first step is to form and build relationships, which we'll talk about. The second stage is to explore the nature of social identity. They have kind of updated this a bit, and they started about 20 years ago. And they say now they're noticing that as opposed to solely social identity like race, class, gender, sexuality, students are much more engaged in themes and topics. They find it to be much more engaging than just the work on, say, privilege, intersectionality, although that's extremely important, but they are more so driven by themes and topics. So I hope I'll give you a good mix of examples of what you can do. And then exploring, the third stage is after you build relationships and explore the nature of social identity, then explore and discuss those hot topics. And then finally, action planning and alliance building. With the third stage, exploring and discussing hot topics, they make it clear that it can't be solely experience and opinion alone, but there does need to be some knowledge base to make these dialogues more effective. And so in your classrooms, of course, we all want just spontaneity and spontaneous, speaking at times, which is fine. But for the conversations to be as effective as they can, they seem to work better when they're based in addition to anecdotal evidence and experience and opinion, if they're based in some type of grounding. And then the action planning and alliance building, it can be really simple. It doesn't mean like starting an organization. That can be just a commitment to staying engaged in conversations across differences. That could be a commitment to read a book on a topic, or personal exploration, or saying you're going to expand your table and share space. So much of what I'll share with you today comes from this particular framing. They give one other insight here that I'll share, which is the anatomy of a workshop. And for you, it may not be a workshop, it may just be a classroom discussion. So you tailor this language to your situation. But the Institute says you need to have a warm-up, and then action, which is usually your discussion piece, and then closure. And I do want to just put a bullet point here that closure, part of closure may mean non-closure. And so your closure may be an acknowledgement that there is no closure or resolution to this particular conversation. And so kind of prepare your students for non-closure as well. And so Finsoy and D'Angelo wrote a very good piece challenging the common guidelines in social justice education. And so they give these tenets that we should just consider when engaging in social justice education. One is to recognize the difference between opinions and informed knowledge, which we just talked about. Look at broader societal patterns. That goes back to those 5 levels of oppression. Notice your own defensive reactions and attempt to use these reactions as entry points for deeper knowledge. Differentiate between safety and comfort, identify where your knowledge base may be and push that further. So if you're a person who feels like I already know all of this, how can you maybe apply that, the information that you know, or keep yourself open to learning more? And then recognize your own social positionality and how that may inform your perspective and reactions to your instructor, your classmates, and those who work that you study in the course. I think this is a really good list. It could be a really good checkbox or self-assessment for us to give to our students as well. I say, I think it's great to have students to self-assess when you're engaging in difficult topics. So all of what I'm giving you right now involves preparation, which is important. Research from University of Michigan from sociologist Mark Chesler, who I'll introduce you to in just a couple of slides. His research really shows that to engage in difficult dialogues, preparation is a part of that. If we prepare, then when we have those spontaneous conversations that just come up, which we hope those will happen as a result of our good preparation, we're able to navigate those conversations much better because we have a foundation of preparation. And so NEP suggests engaging students in the co-creation of a classroom code. And so I like to give students a checklist, and it says, I am more engaged in discussions when, and let them fill in the blank. This is usually for me just an index card or a form. I hope to gain X from these discussions. I'm interested in discussing X. A topic that I tend to shy away from is, I am triggered by, I react to triggers in what way, and a ground rule that I value is. You can make this your own, but this also makes students feel that they have some input in the discussions in the classroom. In my office that I direct, the Intercultural Engagement Center, these are the guidelines or the community contracts that we use when we're having these difficult dialogues. Avoid social justice elitism. We want to acknowledge that everyone is starting from a different location, and that's okay. We may know more or less than other people, that's okay. We like to use the acronym WAIT, which is why am I talking or why aren't I talking? We have to go back to that one quite often, but that is a good guideline for people who are more verbose versus people who are maybe more taciturn, that they can self-assess. Lean into discomfort, listen actively, and impact versus intention. And then we always have a parking lot, as we call it, where students can put other guidelines into our parking lot, and we write those on the board usually, and I'm sure you do something similar. A lot of people add respect to their guidelines. The work of Robin DiAngelo of White Fragility, really cautions against having that one with respect, not because it's a bad guideline, so if you have it, keep it, it's fine, but because so many cultural norms are involved in what people consider to be respect. And the way that people view respect and receive respect is a cultural process. Another one that a lot of people will add is confidentiality. That is fine. A lot of people will say what's learned here leaves here, what's said here stays here. So don't reveal who said what, but certainly take the information out into the community. So those are kind of typical guidelines that we see a lot doing this work. I want to also have you, when you're planning to engage in these difficult conversations, to think about things that we can't name, like we just did on the previous slide. And so there are a lot of ways that people are passive aggressive and even overtly aggressive within these discussions that you may not be able to exactly name. So sometimes people will use cell phones and doodling as a way to be dismissive of people. And I just name this when I'm having these conversations with students, staff, or faculty, that cell phones can be used as a form of passive aggression. And I just name that. And it makes people more aware of the way they may be trying to tune out by looking at a phone or stepping out to take a call or what have you. Silence can be non-engagement, not making eye contact, closed body language. I'm just going to play the devil's advocate. All of these can be mechanisms of passive aggression that I name in the space so that they tend to be much more aware of them if you name them. There are different ways that you can facilitate these conversations in your classrooms or in even larger settings. The three that are most recognized by the research are the impartial facilitator, which means you're neutral, you don't have an opinion, and or you have an opinion, but you're not going to share that opinion. You remain neutral and impartial. Then there is the partial facilitator or the advocate. This actually comes out of feminist theory from the 1970s. And so the partial facilitator is the person who they have a very strong opinion and they voice that, and that position takes authority within the discussion. The danger of both of these stances, impartial, is that most people who engage with you, they want to know where you stand. And it comes across as inauthentic when you're impartial. But partial, or advocating for a position so strongly that it becomes the centered authority, that also can cause people who have an opinion that may be different than your own not to engage. The research tends to support mostly the multi-partial facilitator or multi-partiality, which is where you have a clear position and you're certainly interrogating the master narrative, but at the same time, you are inviting and open to other perspectives. I will say I tend to lean towards the multi-partial facilitator, but there are times when I feel like if I give my opinion, it's going to stifle the conversation. And so in those moments, I may decide to be a neutral facilitator or an impartial facilitator. There are also times when something so harmful and egregious may have happened during a discussion where it has really been very insensitive and caused a lot of pain that I may need to be partial in that moment and an advocate in that moment. So I try to pull from all of these. I lean more so to what the research says with multi-partiality, but there are times when I have to float between these different modalities. And so going back to our 4 stages of intergroup dialogue, the first stage is forming relationships. And so I try to introduce myself with every class, with every group where I'm facilitating, and things that may matter to our discussion and many things that don't matter at all. And so I like for them to see my family. That's my son, Giovanni, and my husband, Julian. I like for them to see my family. In the bottom left, this is a group that I'm in. I've been in for quite some time with Debbie and Monica, and we are a writing group, and we read each other's work and check each other's work and give each other feedback on our work. Someone who has greatly informed my life is Ida B. Wells, women's advocate, anti-lynching advocate, and then I'm a vegetarian and I love to cook vegetarian cuisine. This is tikka masala, one of my favorite dishes to make, an Indian dish. So I just try to let students know who they're getting, who's standing before them. This is a picture of when I got married. I also want them to understand that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just something I do as my profession, because it's actually in my title at my job, but I want them to understand that 15 years ago, when I got married, I was being very intentional about who was in my space. And all of these young women were actually in my wedding when I got married. And I wanted that to be clear to my students that this isn't just something that I have a title for. This is my pastor that's in the other picture, who married us and who's still our pastor 20 years later. But I want them to understand my world, in that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just something that I'm starting from scratch, but it's something I've been cultivating over many years. I don't have a classroom anymore. I told you I taught for 17 years, and then 3 years ago I went into administration. But this is my office, and I try to have my office as a very welcoming space, and a space that bridges a lot of cultures. So hopefully your classrooms, as language educators, our classrooms tend to certainly be on the pinnacle of this. We tend to do a really great job with inclusion in our space. This is a great activity that you can do. I give this to students after about 2 weeks of class, and I just have them, I love doing things where I can get them out of their seats, and I have them to jump up and run around the room. I'm sure you've done something similar, and have them to try to get as many names as possible and learn more about their classmates. Again, it makes it so much easier to engage in dialogues and conversations when we know each other. This Alaskan proverb says, "To teach you, I must know you." I give students an info card as well, where I ask them kind of your typical information, like your name, what are your interests, what year are you in school, things like that. What experience have you had with learning languages? But the main question that I like to ask them is the one that's on the screen here. What do I need to know in order to teach you better? I get so much great information from that one question. And so I use that information to help me in terms of engaging with my students. It helps me a great deal to get that information. I want to just encourage you to have some way that you can share your classroom space with your students. And so this is an example of a wall, and it has chalkboards on one wall in the classroom that you can get from Hobby Lobby, Dollar Tree. And then students can just write random messages. You could make it thematic, where you say, I want all messages to be about identity, all messages to be about culture or travel or whatever you would like for it to be. But this is one wall in a diversity office that I really liked. And so you can see the types of things that students shared on the wall. But it's just a way, and it's social justice issues, and in a way for students to feel like they own some part of the classroom. And the center where I saw this, they take it down once a week. And because students want to add to this so much, they have to take it down once a week and clean it, and then students put things back up. Another way of doing the same thing could be to have a sign that says, in this space, I hope to. Again, all of this can be in the target language, and this would be a great activity in the target language as well. They could write these little notes in the target language, and then you could take them up, take them down, but again, it gives students some ownership of space. And then this is an example of a whiteboard that doing the exact same thing, and where students are writing in the target language. But I think it's important before we ask students to engage in these difficult conversations that we're building that relationship, as the 4-stage model admonishes. So let's get started. I think it can be really easier to start big, kind of like a funnel, and then work your way in with difficult conversations. And so for me, oftentimes I will actually start with pop culture. So start on a broader level. And so this is an example, you know, in pop culture, you will have no paucity or dearth of issues that happen as it relates to diversity. So some of you may recall on The View when Kelly Osbourne, she was truly trying to advocate for Latinx folks. She was really trying to advocate for them when Donald Trump had said he wanted all of them to leave the country and to build a wall and things like that. She was really trying to advocate for them, but she made a statement, and which we'll look at in just a second. Don Omar was also accused of made homophobic comments toward the artist Osuna. Sorry. And so here is something I got offline where Kelly Osbourne actually said, if you kick every Latino out of this country, then who is going to be cleaning your toilet, Donald Trump? Of course, the issue with that is, I don't have to tell you what the issue with that is, I'm sure you see the issue. And so she apologized and she says, I want to start by saying I always take responsibility for my actions. In this particular case, I will take responsibility for my poor choice of words, but I will not apologize for being a racist, as I am not. I wholeheartedly effed up today. I don't want to BS anyone with lame excuses. Although I was stopped mid-sentence by Rosie and couldn't finish my point, I will not let Rosie take responsibility for my words. I would have known better as I was on The View and it was live, et cetera, et cetera. So what I did with this, I made this into a poster and I put it up kind of like a gallery walk all around the room. And I had students, I was doing a workshop with students actually. I had many of these. Let me go to the next one so you can see. I had about 20 of these. The next one I used was Kevin Hart when he said, if my son played with a dollhouse, I'd break it over his head and say, N-word, stop, that's gay. And then he has an apology that comes after that as well. Then Gina Rodriguez uses the N-word, and there's a lot of backlash with her being a non-Black person using the N-word. And so I had these all over the room, and then I had students to walk around and read them, and then I had them to stand under the one that spoke to them the most, and then I had them to discuss why that celebrity mishap had stood out to them. And then we looked at the art of kind of apology and the way they tried to fix the situation. Many of them did not give what the students thought were genuine apologies. They felt there was always a but to their apologies. They felt they weren't sincere. But this was a really great way of talking about social justice in difficult situations without it hitting home as strongly, because we're talking about celebrities and it's not people's necessarily their lived experiences. But the way that we concluded this was to point out how these things hit home, so that we did end up making it very personal. But it was a great way just to start the conversation. Can I ask you all to, on a show of hands, maybe you can use the raise your hand feature to tell me who's familiar with the gender box activity? Okay, I'm looking to see who's raising hands here. Who's familiar with the gender box? Okay.
I see
I
one.
only see 2 people.
Oh, 2, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I only see 2 people who are familiar. Okay, so I was contemplating not going over this, but since only 2 people, I will, because I think it would be great for you. Okay, so the gender box activity, again, I like to start kind of large like a funnel and work my way in. And so I may start at that cultural level, or that institutional level, or that systemic level, and then work my way down to personal and interpersonal. It doesn't always go that way, but sometimes that it's easier to put a little bit of distance between these hot topics and then bring them home. And so the gender box activity, you come up with a social identity. For this case, I'm going to use men. And then the question is, what are the connotations of man? When you think of men, what are dominant societal characteristics of men? So what would the dominant society say if they were to say what constitutes a man? And so tall, dark, and handsome, strong, muscle, cisgender, athletic, handy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these are actual words that I copied and pasted from an actual activity that I did with students. So you box that in, and that's the gender box. Then if someone is outside of that dominant standard, what are words that we may use to describe that person if someone deviates from that dominant standard? And then you write those words, and I pardon the language here, this is real talk, these are real words that the students use when I did this activity with them. And so then you, outside of the gender box, and it doesn't have to be men. I mean, it could be any social identity. It could be Muslim, it could be Christian, it could be formally educated, it could be able-bodied, it could be disabled, what have you. And so you choose the identity, and then you write the words outside of the box of what would someone, how would we view someone in dominant culture if that person deviates from what's inside of the gender box. And so then you use that as a point of discussion. And so here are some discussion questions that I typically use with this. What early messages did you receive about gender? What were the sources of these messages? What is an experience that you have had with the gender box, either inside of the box or outside of the box? What gender norms do you observe at your school, college, university? You could say family, neighborhood. Who are some people who disrupt gender norms, and how do they do it? What risks might one face for not adhering to gender norms? And so this is a great activity that you can use in so many different paradigms. Another way that I do a similar activity is I would write a word like Latinx on the board, and then I would ask, what are the connotations? What comes to mind in dominant society? It may not be one's personal views, but what is the message that we often receive about Latinx people, for example? And maybe immigrant, undocumented, et cetera, et cetera. You can also layer this. So I'll have sometimes several Post-its. One will say Latinx, and then another one may say Latino women, and another one may say Spaniards, another one Puerto Ricans, and then you can see the variance of the way that people are portrayed, even within one social group. Once we break those things down, what are the different connotations that we have? And then we can use that to jump into a dialogue or a discussion. And so some of the questions that I asked with that, where do these stereotypes come from? What impact do they have? How are they negotiated? And how can they be combated, for example? Another activity for starting a dialogue and forming relationships is the culture box. So not the gender box, but the culture box. And this is where students actually do kind of a crafty project where they decorate a shoebox or any type of a box that they want. And then they put 3 things inside of that box that they value. And then you can use that to launch into discussion. And you can take that wherever you want to take that discussion. This is from edchange.org. I really like this activity. I will say my students oftentimes will ask me to do this activity. They really like this activity as well. I put them into, and this is very much so adapted from EdChange. So if you go to their website, you'll see the same thing, but they don't have the privileged or underprivileged categories there, and they don't have nearly as many of the categories that I've added to this, but it's similar. And so I asked them to write in that blank, what is your education level? What is your race or ethnicity? What is your language, sexuality? This is all a personal assessment that they will not show to anybody. And so they can be as transparent as they want to be. And then I asked them to check the box. Would it be a privileged position or an underprivileged position? And then I put them in small groups, and then they can discuss what they want to discuss. There's no force here, and if there are parts of their identity that they're not comfortable discussing, they don't have to ever mention that. They have so many boxes or circles that they can only talk about 1 or 2, and that's perfectly fine. And then in small groups, I ask them what makes you proud to be a member of that group, what is difficult about being a member of that group, what are stereotypes associated with that group, et cetera, et cetera. I don't force them to answer all 6 questions. I tell them they can answer maybe 1 or 2 of those questions. So if they don't want to talk about difficulty or stereotypes, they can just talk about what makes them proud. So they have a lot of options there. but this is a great activity to get that conversation started. So another poll question for you. In the last 6 months, try to be honest here. In the last 6 months, have you had an in-person conversation about a social justice issue with someone who disagreed with your views? Yes or no? So I'm looking at the numbers here, they're coming in. In the past 6 months, have you had an in-person conversation about a social justice issue with someone who disagreed with your views? So about 76% so far are saying yes, they have, and about 24%, about a quarter, are saying no, they have not. So I mention this because I use in-person because a lot of times these conversations are happening now on social media a lot, and people oftentimes lack the skill or the finesse to have these conversations in person because they're happening so much on social media. And oftentimes the research actually shows us that this is actually rare. So this is, of course, a dynamic group because you're in the social justice CX, so this is a dynamic group. But the research actually shows us that most people rarely have conversations face-to-face with people with whom they disagree about a social justice issue. Most of us have many conversations about race, class, gender, immigration, politics, with people who share our views, our family members, etc. But it's actually not nearly as common to have these conversations with people who disagree with us. So I wish we had a mechanism where I could know, like, how did that work? How did that, if we had more time, but very interesting. So Mark Chesler, I really like his work. He's a sociologist. I'm also being very intentional about using images of people. That's not just because I'm giving this webinar, but even in my classrooms, and now I give a lot of workshops and trainings. I use images of people a lot because I want my audience to know where my body of work is coming from. And also it is an accountability check for me to show, am I being inclusive in terms of the people that I'm including in my workshops and classrooms? And so Chesler says, many faculty are no more prepared for the increasing diversity of the academy than are students. And everyone's skill and attitude gaps can create a climate that is difficult for learning. So Chesler feels that these difficulties that we face in dialogue are actually very co-constructed. He feels that educators lack the skills to be able to have these conversations, but also students. He feels like there's a lack of preparation on both sides. And so with this, I'm actually going to, for time, I'm going to skip this slide. And so at the University of Michigan, they did a survey of over 800 faculty, and 30% of their faculty reported disrespect from students toward faculty. 20% reported student-to-student disrespect. So you would think that with these dialogues and there being kind of an atmosphere of incivility in some classrooms, in some spaces, that these dialogues would be less important. However, the research actually says, but the opportunity, reading the quote on your screen, and ability to engage in communication across differences, even controversial or heated ones, is essential in a classroom, college, or society. The next quote similarly says, thorny issues and discussions that ensue may be discomforting, but are necessary if we are to address injustice adequately and ethically. So even though it may not be easy to have these conversations, all the research says we still need to engage in these conversations if we are going to have ethics in our classrooms and social justice and dealing with making our content relevant and engaging and accessible, as the slide that I started out with. So I have a program at my institution called Multicultural Leadership Scholars, where I train students to engage in difficult dialogues with their peers and to facilitate these discussions with their peers. And we've presented this research quite a bit at different conferences. And these, in the picture on your right, those are two of my students in the middle. One's a junior and one's a senior at Guilford College, who help us to facilitate difficult conversations. And to the far left, that's my assistant. And these are two students who we've trained in the center pictures, who help us to lead these conversations. So a lot of what I'm telling you comes from those spaces. Here, this is one of our students leading one of those conversations on challenging topics. And so some of our tools, Robin DiAngelo and Sensoy wrote this article that I referenced earlier, and they say that we need ways of even starting the discussion. And so some of the starters that you might could use in your classrooms, of course, you're welcome to put these in the target language. From my experience as an African-American woman, et cetera, et cetera. This perspective is new to me, but I'm wondering if it is accurate to say. This is what I understand you to be saying. Is that accurate? It seems like some people may have had a reaction to what I just said. Can you help me to understand why? I will self-monitor, but please let me know if my comments are misplaced or offensive, and I've adapted some of the language here. It feels risky to say X, but I'm still working through my thoughts on this, but. So these are all ways to give people certain language ability to engage in these conversations. This is a chart that I've been working on for a while now, just what I'm learning from doing this work so much. Let's say that an offensive comment is made. And many times in workshops, people want kind of a 2 + 2 = 4. And I don't have that because I think so many situations are different and they require very different strategies. And so I'm going to put on the screen about 10 different ways that you could respond to that one comment. So I believe that Trump should build a wall to keep out terrorists. Let's say that someone says that in your classroom or something equivalent that's insensitive to a large group of people or to one person. Here are some different ways that one could respond. So I teach the students that I train all of these different strategies, and you pick the one that you feel may work best in your given situation. So maybe you want to clarify. When you said X, I heard, felt, or understood. In my experience, maybe another way that you want to address that. And also, people have very different personalities. Some people are very direct and they will go straight on with you. Other people really need ways that they can get to the same point, but using different skills. I find your comment offensive. Some people might be offended by that comment, very indirect instead of I'm offended. A question, would you say that all Mexicans are like that? Would you be open to an alternative perspective? That is a very popular statement that I've taught people on my campus, and they use that one a lot to bring in different perspectives. I respectfully disagree that our goal on this team is to build an inclusive community. So maybe not even addressing the situation directly, but just restate your goals. An egress strategy or a way out. I'm sorry, I need to check in with Professora. Some people, it's better for them to just remove themselves from the situation. That comment is offensive and I need to step away. Some people are stepping away, but they're very direct in letting you know why I can't engage with you. Education. Actually, there's never been a case of terrorism from the southern border. A diversion, just to talk about a different topic altogether. Again, some people are very direct. I find that comment offensive and here is why. Other people, I don't have that same value and they may address it in a very different way. But I think what's valuable is giving people many tools in their toolbox to figure out what's best to use when and where. Courageous Conversations, there's a 2015 edition of that book, that's the 2005. White Fragility and Say the Wrong Thing are all really great books, and within them, it says specifically educators need to address their own racial attitudes. Robin DiAngelo says, I believe that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. And then Amanda Kemp says, what negative stereotypes have you internalized about your own groups? So these are 3 different ways of approaching that introspection. I try to really acknowledge when I make a mistake. I think that makes it more relatable for my students. And so here's a time when I misgendered someone. And it was at an event and there was no way for me to fix it in the moment because everyone was gone. So I posted something on my school page of social media. And I said, I wish to acknowledge that I misgendered participants and that was wrong. I will never hide from any error in judgment, but I will always own it. I'm very sorry and it will not happen again. I felt I needed to address it publicly because it happened in a very public space. It was at a conference. And I didn't know what reactions I was going to get, quite frankly. But you can see from Dominic's response that the reception was very well. And so I think people really appreciate people just owning and acknowledging when they're wrong and not leaning into social justice elitism. I would caution in using words like "it will not happen again." If I had it to do all over again, I would remove that sentence because it will happen again. Stumbling is a part of the journey, and I think we need to normalize that. We need to do our work, but we also need to normalize that we will stumble in doing this work. So instead of using language like "I will never," I try to teach my students to say things like, instead of saying "I am not racist" or "I'm not homophobic," use language like "I'm working to become less racist." "I'm learning to be an effective ally." "I'm dealing with my issues." Language on a continuum as opposed to absolutes. Lead with I statements instead of interrogating other people, which is a part of this work as well that should be done, but we also should be constantly doing our introspective work. And then where are your treasures? And so I showed you photos of my wedding. In those types of weddings, baby showers, things like that, oftentimes we include the people who mean the most to us. That could be a way for us to look at who's in our circle and who's not in our circle. Now, it doesn't make you a bad person if everyone at your wedding looked like you. It does not make you a bad person at all. It's not about good or bad people, but it may show that there could be a gap in the information that you're receiving if your circle is very homogenous. And so I think that's a good introspection. And also just what are you silent about? And then what do you talk a lot about? Being very talkative about an issue doesn't mean you are more woke or conscious about that issue. It could actually be a mask for being uncomfortable with that issue. But you need to kind of, and silence doesn't mean that you don't care about the issue. It may be that you're still contemplating, but you do need to kind of do some introspective work on what you're silent about and what really calls your attention. The comfort zone activity, the research shows us that if you stay in your position of comfort, very little learning can happen there. If you reach the panic zone where you're absolutely panicked, very little growth and learning happens there either. You want to actually go beyond your comfort zone to the learning zone, but not so far over the edge that you become panicked and you shut down. And so that's something as facilitators for us to get to. In that questionnaire, you can ask your student what triggers you. How do you respond to trigger? If they say, I put my head down, I close my eyes, I put my, I start playing with my phone, you can start helping them to self-monitor and watch for that panic zone so that the learning can still take place. A great activity that goes along with that, and it's very low risk, and my students really tend to enjoy this. I put them in a line and I read some statements to them, and I ask them to move to the left if they're completely comfortable with what I'm saying, or the right if they're very uncomfortable. And then I have them, if they want to, some volunteers can explain why, but they don't have to. And so some of the questions I may ask is, how comfortable are you being asked to state your pronouns? They would move to the left if they're completely comfortable, or the right if they're really uncomfortable. And the only rules are no judgment, no censorship, and no challenge. This is an activity where your opinion stands on its own. And we may do a follow-up activity where we have some engagement with people's thoughts and beliefs. But you can see some of the questions that I asked them on the screen. Try to wrap up here in just a few more minutes so we can see if we have any questions. I'm going to skip this poll. You can, it's totally up to you if you want to keep this conversation in your classroom in the target language, or if you want to have it in English. That is up to your value system. The conversation can happen in the target language, or it can happen in English. Either way, students just have to be prepared for that. And so here I had someone to observe me and my students when I was teaching Spanish, and they were completely engaged in a conversation about social movements in Latin America, particularly in Mexico and Argentina. And she talks about how my students were able to summarize those two movements in Spanish. She talked about how my students were able to create an analysis with the Venn diagram about those movements. And at the very end, she says they were so engaged in the conversation about social movements that they didn't realize that the class had ended. And so it's totally possible to do this in the target language. I see no hierarchy, and I have had these discussions. If my students do not have the linguistic resources to have these discussions in the target language, I see no issue at all with moving to English, because I think it's that important. I wish I could say that all conversations go well, but they do not. So I had a group of students, I think I have about 5 more minutes for you all. I had a group of students, they were white students, who made a pact, and one of them came and told me about this pact, that whenever students of color spoke about injustice or pain, that they would do something to avert attention. So they would rattle paper, they would play with their phones, they would not make eye contact. We ended up having a mediation over that, and it did not bring friendship. So again, non-closure does happen, but these particular students, and like I said, one came and told me about this pact that they had made. I had a Mexican-American student who felt there was absolutely nothing wrong with making derogatory remarks about Mexicans, even though she was half Mexican herself. I had an African-American student who said that she didn't see a problem with white people using the N-word. I had a group of students to complain to my chair that I talked about social justice too much, which was the biggest compliment I've ever received. And I had a Latino student who said that white students needed to participate in these dialogues. It was exhausting never having them to participate. I handle each of these situations in very different ways. In one, we did have a mediation. In another one, I tried to educate on personally, you may not be offended by certain comments, but what are the larger implications of these derogatory remarks for other groups? And you don't get to speak for every one of your particular group. I made my syllabus more clear to show that we would be discussing social justice in the classroom. And when the students were not participating, I reminded them of our guidelines, the weight guidelines. So I didn't address all of these situations in one way, but again, having multiple tools in my arsenal. Also, I would say you need to think about the challenges that you face and also your successes. So with that first class, it was very successful. You saw that the students didn't even know that the class had ended. It was going so well. These are examples where there were challenges. I actually write these up just like I've done for you. I put my students in groups and I give them these different scenarios. Oftentimes I'll change all of the identifiable information and details so they can't locate where this came from. But then I'll have them to work through, what would you do if this happened? What would you do if you were in this classroom and this happened? How would you engage that? How would you navigate that? And so you can use your moments as actual theoretical frameworks to give you tools and also your students tools. And so, let's see, okay, well, we're at the end here. So there are some activities that I think work really well. Musical papers is an activity where I have students to respond to a prompt. In this case, it's what is a stereotype about your identity that you have to navigate on a regular basis. And then but the paper is completely anonymous. This is great for like recycled paper, so you can't see the paper is random. And I have them to respond to a prompt, don't put any names on the paper. And then I pass that paper out to their classmates to read, and their classmates write a response. It has to be an affirming response of a comment or a question. And then we shuffle papers again and pass them out again, and then give them back to the students, and they have 2 or 3 responses to their particular prompt that they wrote. I also do some embodied pedagogy where I will give students a word, and the word could be immigration. It could be social justice. And they can't use any words or write anything down. They just have to express that with their body, and they're the only ones who know what word they've received. And then the students have to guess what were they trying to convey. and we use that as conversation. Reader's theater, we oftentimes will take those musical papers, make those into a script, and then the class will be in a circle and we will read the different experiences of our peers without knowing whose identity is what. And then a way of closing, oftentimes for me, I like to do sister circle, or if you want to use non-gendered language, I taught at a women's college for a long time, so we use that language. It may be a sharing circle or a sibling circle, and I ask them an important question. And it could be, when you offend me, and you is just in general, when someone offends me, I need for you to. And this is a great way for us to work in a circle in a united space to tell what do we need to thrive in these social justice settings. Or as a person of color in a white space, I need for you to. And then as an ally, this is what I want or what I desire. I will close this presentation by discussing just collaboration, and just by saying how important it is that we work in collaboration. And so I started this presentation by talking about Cassandra Glenn and just getting to sit in on her presentations years ago and how that still impacts the work that I do now. There's the student that observed my class. I learned about her from a colleague at another institution who said, you should observe Krishauna's class. She does a lot of social justice work since you're writing your dissertation on this. And the young woman came and observed my class. When she wrote her dissertation, one of her committee members was L.J. Randolph, who I'm sure a lot of you know from the SIG. But it's just beautiful to me the way when I met this young lady, she was a master's student writing her master's thesis, and that ended up turning into her dissertation. And one of my colleagues was on that committee. And I couldn't have done any of this work without having the connections to the people who are on that screen. And then I talked to you about Tamara Hughes Akimbo, her classroom, inviting me in, allowing me to do a presentation to her students. That really sparked my desire to say we need to have more difficult dialogues because our students are saying they don't know about each other and they want to learn more. Finally, most recently, I presented at ACTFL with a French teacher. I taught Spanish, Kristen Campbell, and we wrote an article about our collaboration together. And so I thought it would make sense to just finish at ACTFL since we started at ACTFL. And so she wrote, without Krishauna's knowledge of the Dominican culture, we did a presentation on Haiti and the Dominican Republic. She had a great deal of expertise on Haiti. My expertise was more on the Dominican Republic. We came together and presented that research together. So she says, without Krishauna's knowledge of the Dominican culture, I believe my research would have been incomplete. Standing alongside my colleague reinforced the overall accuracy of the information shared. Furthermore, and perhaps more importantly, our collaboration acted as a model for peace between two divided cultures. There was no rivalry between us of which country, language, or culture was more important, rather a seamless unity of diversity. And so my closing thought is just, we don't have to do this alone. I think it's so important that we can continue to cross languages and borders, both figuratively and literally, and continue to work together to get the tools that we need to engage in these difficult discussions. So thank you very much. And that concludes my presentation to you.
Thank you. So we are a little over, so I'm just going to do a couple of questions that came in, but I encourage everyone to go on the community and continue these conversations, continue asking questions. So we did have one question come in a little while ago that asked, hold on, let me find it again. It was talking about how you teach your students to agree or disagree with their conversations. So this person asked, they have respectful conversations in class, but then they are respectful and judgmental outside of class, and that can impact their future conversations in class. So what would you recommend for those kinds of situations?
Very interesting. So what's happening in the classroom is not necessarily being translated outside of the classroom. I think one is to deal with that. I think one is to ask the students, not necessarily the students who are directly involved, but to ask them, and this is where our comfort level with conflict becomes important, to simply have a discussion about why is that? And so what is it that you all value in this space? And it's probably the way that the instructor has navigated the space and structured the space. That's not happening. That structure is not there in other spaces, so they're not valuing the information in the same way. And so I think one thing to do is to have that discussion, to hear from students kind of what breaks down when you leave from this space. But I think more so what I'm seeing in this is that it's not necessarily a classroom issue, since it's working well in the classroom. It is an institutional. So this is where we go back to those 5 levels of oppression. I think this is where the teacher for whom this work is working well needs to start collaborating in other spaces with the guidance counselor, with the principal, with other teachers of other disciplines, to say, if we were all engaged in this work, we would have a much better chance of having civility in different spaces if they saw it modeled in different spaces. And so just like, I worked with Kristen, if more people outside of that one language classroom where it's working well could come together and students know that this is a united effort, I think that they would have respect in other spaces outside of the classroom.
Perfect. Okay. I'm not sure if you want to do one more or... Sure. Okay, let's see. Let me go back through. So we did have one person asking, she said, I'm Asian American teacher, and with the rise of anti-Asian racism around the country, what do you think the schools or educators can do to help their students and faculty, who are often a super minority in the communities, while dealing with the anger and grief from other community members who may feel the urge to place blame?
Yeah, that's I'm so sorry that that's happening, and it's just terrible. I'm so sorry that that's happening. I think one of the ways to deal with that is through integrated movements. And so when I think the more, so for example, I'm teaching a class right now on global feminism, transnational feminism. And we have, at our institution, we've had quite a bit of unrest with Israel and Palestine conflicts. And so one of the things that we're doing to address that is to look at integrated movements and the way that different movements have addressed those difficulties. And so, for example, Black Lives Matter is standing with Palestine right now, but they're also in support of some of the Jewish organizations as well. And so we're looking at the different ways that these groups, who seemingly would not have a whole lot in common, like Black Lives Matter and Palestine, have come together to address certain concerns. And so I think that can be a really powerful practice with this situation with xenophobia and with anti-Asian rhetoric, to look at what are ways, what can we learn from other social movements? What are the integrations of other social movements? The class that I'm teaching is with an Indian professor who is in a very low caste in the Indian state. And so we are talking about the racial stratification and hierarchy in the United States and how that looks in the Indian context of the caste system. That has actually been very powerful for us to be able to discuss stratification and discrimination against groups by bridging those two divides, if you will. And so I think in this case, one thing, it can seem, and I hate to use this word, but it can seem kind of, I won't use that word, it can seem distant to people when it does not directly impact them, which is so terrible, because we shouldn't have to personalize things for people to feel empathy, but oftentimes we do. And so in this case, because it may not be directly impacting someone, or they don't see the direct impact, if you can show how what's happening to Chinese Americans and Chinese people is not very different than the rhetoric that is used to marginalize other groups, oftentimes there's more support and solidarity for that work if you can address it in the integrated fashion.
Perfect. Okay, so we are very much over, so I'm not going to have any more questions, but Krishauna's email is there on the screen. Again, this will be uploaded to the community. You are all free to reach out to her there. It's a great space. Again, I know we keep promoting it. If you're not on the ACTFL community, it's a really neat place. But Kathy, did you have anything else you would like to say before we sign off?
Just thank you again, Krishauna, as per usual. So many wonderful, wonderful ideas, and just really appreciate your work and having you join us. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you at future webinars.
Thank you.